Welcome back. This is going to be screencast number 2 for chapter 28, and our focus today is going to be food and feeding. In other words, looking at the digestive tract of these animals because it could be quite varied depending on the type of food that they eat. And we're going to finish up today by looking at their reproductive behaviors. Now, for food and feeding, mammals tend to exploit a wide variety of food sources, and that's what makes this group kind of unique. And in fact, if you look over here on the right, you can see quite a variety in terms of their skeletal structure and the teeth that you would find in each of these different animals. Based on the teeth, that can give you a pretty good indication as to what these animals will feed on. For example, if you look over here at the carnivores, the coyote for example, they tend to have very large canines and definitely have incisors. And this is going to be used to, of course, capture their prey and be able to rip the prey apart. When you compare that over here to the herbivores, organisms such as, or animals such as deer, they're primarily going to be grazing type of animals. So the idea that they need really long canines isn't really necessary, but they do tend to focus on molars and premolars. And so these tend to be quite wide when you look at these animals, and it's going to be used to kind of grind up the food that they eat, so the grasses, the vegetation, etc. Down here towards the bottom, if you look, we have Insectivores, and these animals have almost completely lost their teeth, and so their tongue is identified as their principal feeding tool. So again, looking at this diagram, you can tell that definitely some of these animals are considered specialist. For example, the insectivore that you see down here, and then of course we have others that are going to be generalist, and those are the ones that actually have a variety of teeth, and so they could take advantage of sort of a predator-prey type of thing, kind of like the coyote, or maybe they do eat some, vegetation, different types of plants, and so this would be considered our omnivores. So it just kind of depends on the type of mammal that you're looking at. So as we had said, the structure of the teeth is going to reveal the habits of the mammal. Definitely going to be different in regards to what those teeth are going to be used for. Some of them will be used for cutting, some might be used for seizing, they may be used for gnawing. Now we're going to take a little bit closer look at the different types of teeth. As I had said, those teeth are going to reveal a lot when it comes down to their diet. One of the teeth that I had mentioned was the incisors. And over here on the right you can see the incisor being represented right here. Now they're going to tend to have very sharp edges, and they're going to be used primarily for snipping or biting. So again, the carnivores definitely will have pretty significant incisors. Now the canines again are going to be used in the carnivore group, and they're going to be specialized for piercing. Those animals that have premolars, those are going to be ones that have, and you can see those over here on the right, there's going to be teeth that have a compressed crown with one or two cusps for shearing and for slicing. Now the molars over here, like you can see right here, are going to be larger body teeth, and they're going to have a variable cusp, and again the cusp is just this area of the tooth right here. And so that arrangement is going to be a bit different because it's going to be used primarily for crushing and grinding. Mammals typically do not continually replace teeth, kind of like similar to what we had talked about with the sharks. The sharks will continually replace teeth over their lifetime. Typically they will have one set of what we call deciduous teeth, and deciduous would be kind of similar to the baby teeth, and then of course they would have one set of permanent teeth. So once those permanent teeth come in, they're not going to get any sets of teeth after that. Now, some of the feeding specializations that I had mentioned a little bit earlier, one of them being the insectivores, and these would be things like the shrews, the moles, the anteaters. They're going to have a digestive tract that is going to be relatively short. And over here on the right, you can see an example of their digestive tract in comparison to the other two that you see here. If you have an animal or a mammal that's considered an herbivore, they're going to have reduced or absent canines, as we had said earlier, but their molars are going to be very broad and they're going to be very highly crowned. And they generally do tend to have a very long digestive tract. And the main reason for this is because fiber is very difficult to digest, and so there needs to be a long period of time to make sure that fiber can be broken down. They do tend to use anaerobic fermentation, and so fermentation is one of those words that you might remember back in biology. And these fermentation chambers, again, are going to be used to primarily digest that fiber, which is primarily in the form of cellulose. Now, if you're a mammal that's a carnivore, most of these carnivores are going to feed on herbivores, and they do require sort of a specialization for killing their prey. In other words, the behavior that they use is going to be kind of specialized to that group. They're going to have a very high protein diet because their food is primarily easily digestible, and therefore the digestive tract doesn't really need to be quite as long as what you would see in the herbivores. Now, a lot of these animals out there are actually going to have the best of both worlds. They're going to be identified as omnivores. Now, if you're an omnivore, you tend to feed both on plant and animal tissues. Some of the animals that you might recognize, like pigs, raccoons, rats, bears, and actually a lot of the primates, including humans, are considered omnivores. Many carnivores, if there's any type of hardship in the environment, some of them will actually switch to fruits, berries, etc when the other food sources are somewhat scarce. Now, as I had said a little bit earlier, we're going to finish up this screencast by talking about the different types of reproductive cycles that you would see in mammals. Now, when you talk about a mammal's reproductive cycle, oftentimes we'll use the term estrus. Now, estrus basically means when the animal is going to be receptive to reproduction. Now, most mammals have mating seasons, and these are timed to coincide with the most favorable time to give birth and, of course, to rear young. Females will usually restrict mating to a fertile period, and this is going to be during that estrus cycle, and that's commonly called heat, or if you're in a science class, typically called the estrus part of the cycle. Now, again, this estrus cycle is going to have varying parts to it, and there's going to be four primary parts. If a female mammal is in proestrus, this is going to be the period of preparation when the new follicle, and the follicle is the egg that is growing inside of the female. This is going to be preparing that egg to be released. Now, if the female has moved into estrus, this is when mating is going to occur, so this is when the female is going to be receptive to the male, and it's typically simultaneous with ovulation, and ovulation is just the release of the egg. Now there's Maaan Estrus, and this is going to be the period of repair that occurs if a female does not become pregnant. And the repair typically is going to happen with the uterus, because the uterus has to primarily become engorged with blood and prepare to nourish that hopefully developing embryo if fertilization occurs. Then we're going to have diestrus, and this is when the uterus becomes very small and anemic until the cycle again is going to repeat itself, which means we'll go through these four stages again. Now, some animals will actually lengthen their gestation period by performing a delayed implantation. So this is where it's going to resist implanting that maybe blastocyst or that developing egg into the uterine lining. And it could be in response to any type of unfavorable condition in the environment. And this is basically to postpone it, so we want to make sure that there's a good season available to be able to rear the young. Now, animals with only one breeding season a year are considered Maaan Estrus. And if you are a mammal that has a recurrent breeding season, you are considered Polyestrus. Now, when you talk about old world monkeys and humans, they typically have a cycle that's going to be terminated by menstruation. Now, menstruation typically involves just the shedding of the endometrium or the lining of the uterus. And so this is going to be the time where if fertilization does not occur with the egg, this is going to be kind of a sloughing off of that lining. And so this is typically when some bleeding might occur. Now, the female, if you are a type of mammal that goes through this type of menstrual cycle, the female does tend to be receptive to the male year-round. So it doesn't tend to be seasonal. Now, when you look at different groups of mammals, their reproductive patterns can be kind of unique. One group are called the monotremes, and these are considered the only egg-laying type of mammals. Examples of these would be the duck-billed platypus, like you see over here on the right, and they lay eggs with one breeding season per year. So these mammals actually do lay eggs, and you can see more again over here on the right. The eggs are going to be fertilized in the oviduct before the albumen and a very thin leathery shell is added. So this leathery shell is kind of reminiscent of the reptiles that we had looked at back in chapter 26. Now the eggs are going to be laid in a burrow nest, and they're going to be incubated by the female for a period of about 12 days. No gestation period occurs, and the egg provides all the nutrients, so there's no connection between the young and the mother as they're developing. Now, after hatching, instead of nourishing themselves from milk that's produced by teats or nipples on the female, the young are basically going to lap up the milk from the mother's fur near the mammary glands. Now, if you are a pouched marsupial or a pouch type of mammal, these are considered viviparous mammals. And this is when the embryo is going to be first encapsulated by a shelled membrane. So not like the leathery shells that you would see in monotremes, but a very, very thin shell. And it's going to float free in the uterus for several days. Now, after hatching from that very thin membrane, the embryo is going to erode a very shallow depression in the uterine wall and start to absorb nutrient secretions by a vascularized milk sac. So vascularized basically means that the yolk sac is inundated with veins and vessels. Now the gestation is going to be very brief, and the marsupials are going to give birth to very, very tiny young that are still embryos. So they're very underdeveloped, as you can see over here on the right. Early birth is going to be followed by a prolonged interval of lactation, so they're going to feed for a pretty long period of time, and the parental care is going to take place primarily in the mother's pouch, where she can protect the growing marsupial. Now, with wide variation, marsupials tend to have young born at extremely early stages of development. So when you look over here, you can definitely see it looks very different from a typical mammal that would be born that is not considered a marsupial. Now, placental mammals like ourselves, they're going to have embryos that are going to be nourished in a uterus through a placenta. The gestation does tend to be much longer than you would see in marsupials. And in very large mammals, for example, like an elephant, the gestation could be as long as 2 to 2.5 years. Gestation and body size are loosely correlated to variation in maturity at birth. And so again, this is going to be based on the type of mammal that you're looking at. Humans tend to have a slower developmental period as compared to any other mammal that you might look at. Alright, so that's going to finish up our second and final screencast for Chapter 28, and in fact, this is going to be our final screencast for the entire year. As always, please make sure that you have completed your screencast study guide before you come to class.